Remembered. Okay, everybody's got to say got it. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of our online Zoom Midland-Penetanguishene Field Naturalist meetings. Good to see a nice turnout again tonight. I'm Susan Hurst. I'm the club president, and tonight we're going to be having a talk by a young woman called Jessica Linton. And Jessica is going to be telling us about reintroducing the mottled Duskywing. And Ken will give you more details when he introduces her. So again, we're glad to have everybody here. And before we start the presentation, one of our club members, Kate Harries, has got a few words to say regarding her project or her involvement with the project at the Tiny Marsh. So I'll hand it over.
Just before that happens, Susan, we remembered the record button, but I forgot something else. I'm going to mute everybody right now.
Mute everybody, right? Okay.
And then anybody who speaks, like Kate and Jessica, you have to unmute yourself. So let me just do that. Okay, you're all muted, and if you, again, Kate, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, well, I just wanted to let you know that the Phragmites project that has been ongoing at Tiny Marsh this summer, but kind of limping along because we didn't get the federal funding that we applied for. So we got a bit of money from Tiny Township and a bit of money from Ducks Unlimited, and we did the mapping and we did a volunteer effort through in August, which had an amazing response, twice what I expected. And this is suddenly September the 14th, I get an email from Environment Canada saying our project has been approved. And it's too late to do a whole lot of things that we had planned, but it's a 3-year project. So we're just going ahead probably next week with truck saws, which are amphibious vehicles that go into the marsh, and they cut the Phragmites off underneath the water so that it drowns and drag it back. And that's going to be happening during 3 days next week if the weather cooperates, because the hydraulics of these things, I think 8 degrees is the cutoff. They won't work if it's colder than 8 degrees. So it's kind of a little bit cut and miss, but that project is going ahead, and I feel really pleased about that, because the Phragmites has been an offensive thing in my eyes since I joined the board 10 years ago. I should also tell you I was president of MTM Conservation, which runs Tiny Marsh as well as 2 other provincial wildlife areas, for a year, but I didn't stand again. And we had our AGM recently, and so I'm still on the board, and I will be spearheading the FRAG project, but I'm not president. Bob Codd remains on the board too. I'm sad to say that it was just the 2 of us at that AGM. All the rest of the people, nearly all of them, were, well, they weren't the people from the club that we would have liked to have seen, but I hope you will be involved in the coming year anyhow. So thank you. I think that was a fly. Okay, so that's all I have to say.
Anything else from you, Susan Hurst?
No, I don't think so. Oh. Ready to move on.
I'm going to introduce our speaker. Am I on camera? Can everybody see me? Yeah. Jessica Linton is a biological consultant who works on a variety of species at risk inventory, monitoring, research, and recovery projects. She is the coordinator of the Ontario Butterfly Species at Risk Recovery and Implementation Team and the author of the draft COSEWIC status report and provincial recovery strategy for the mottled duskywing butterfly. Anybody that doesn't know what COSEWIC means, it stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and they're an independent arm's-length advisory panel to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And Jessica is working on the recovery strategy for the mottled duskywing and the national recovery strategies for frosted elfin, eastern Perseus duskywing, and Carner blue. Jessica is also a member of the COSEWIC Arthropod Specialist Subcommittee and past president of the Toronto Entomologists Association. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica, and Jessica, you'll have to unmute yourself, and I'll try to pin you so everybody can see you. And you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, I'm sharing now, so if I get a head nod that everyone can see my screen and hear me okay? Okay.
Looks good, you're full screen, yep.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, everyone, for having me. It's kind of been a pleasure this year. I tried to do a lot of outreach about the recovery work that I'm doing, but I've certainly been able to reach a lot more people this year doing these virtual meetings. I've given field naturalist talks all over the province, which is kind of nice. So tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about this mottled duskywing recovery project that I've been working on with my collaborators for the last few years, and how that ties into the overall work that the butterfly recovery team is doing here in Ontario. So just quickly to kind of set the stage for how and why we do this recovery work, it all comes back to this term that you hear a lot, which is species at risk. And probably many of you know that species at risk are at some level of risk of extinction in Canada, and they're worth protecting. And there's a lot of these poster child or poster species that you see represented when we talk about species at risk, like polar bears and caribou, Blanding's turtle, for example. But there are a lot of also untalked about species at risk, and these are usually the arthropods or insects, the lesser known species that don't necessarily make really sexy posters for species at risk. They don't necessarily receive a lot of funding for species at risk things. And those are kind of the underdogs that I'm aiming to help. And mottled duskywing, I think, certainly falls into that category because that enigmatic monarch is always trying to take all of the funding away in terms of butterfly recovery. So the way that species at risk get looked at in Canada and in Ontario is through this cyclical process, which starts with a species status assessment. So when Ken introduced me, he mentioned that I developed the draft status report for the mottled duskywing. And that's essentially a document that COSEWIC, this independent body that our federal government has, will put out a bid for species that they think are worth looking at in terms of its conservation status. And usually it's a third party contract, and someone gets contracted to collect all the available information on a species and develop an assessment of what's threatening that species and provides a recommendation on whether they think it should be a species at risk. So the mottled duskywing was I assessed it in 2007, so quite a few years ago. I traveled through 3 provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba, in order to look for populations of the species. And at that time, I had never even seen a mottled duskywing. And I was, through my travels, checking all these historical locations, getting really disheartened about the lack of finding it. I wasn't finding it at any of its historical locations. I did end up finding it in a few places in the end. And through that process, the recommendation that went forward for that species was that it should be endangered. So after the committee recommended that it receive the status of endangered, that automatically, that assessment at the federal level triggered the requirement for the province of Ontario to also complete an assessment of that species. They accepted the designation as endangered. And when it was listed as endangered in the province, it automatically received protection under the Ontario Species or Endangered Species Act. Now, a species that receives protection under the Endangered Species Act automatically is mandated by the province, if it's endangered or threatened, to have a recovery strategy developed for it. And a recovery strategy is essentially just a planning document that outlines how the province is going to go about protecting and recovering that species. So that recovery strategy for mottled duskywing was completed in 2015. And immediately following the publishing of that recovery strategy, I began working on different tasks that were outlined in that strategy to implement them and actually do something on the ground to recover the species. We're kind of in the stage right now where we're somewhere between implementation and monitoring and evaluation. And in another few years, usually it's a 10-year cycle, the species will be reassessed. So all of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today, the goal is that by the time the species comes up for reassessment, we've made some progress towards recovering the species, and hopefully there's a possibility that it could be downlisted. So as I mentioned, the mottled duskywing is an endangered species. This is what it looks like. It's a small spread-wing skipper. It's not very showy, and it can be easily confused with other duskywing species. If you're familiar with duskywings, they're all very difficult to identify. They're kind of like the sparrows of the butterfly world. Some interesting things about this species is that similar to a lot of butterflies, it's a specialist on its larval food plant. So for example, we know that monarchs only feed on milkweed plants. Mottled duskywings only feed on 2 species in the genus Ceanothus. One of those is, the common name is New Jersey tea, which is pictured on the right there. And the other species is narrow-leaved New Jersey tea, or also known as prairie redroot. And both of those species occur throughout southern Ontario, primarily in oak savanna or alvar systems, although it will grow in other disturbed habitats as well. But the only habitats that mottled duskywing is associated with are these more rare oak savanna and alvar systems. The larva and the egg are shown there at the bottom of the screen. And so all of these life stages have a very close association with this plant. You never find the mottled duskywing very far from its host plant. Its females lay the eggs on the plant, the larvae live on the plant, the pupa are formed usually at the base of the plant, and then the adults, even as they're flying around, will nectar on the flowers as well. So they're really closely tied to this plant. Like all butterflies, mottled duskywing has a 4-stage life cycle, which begins, of course, with the egg. When a female lays the egg, they hatch within about 7 days. And then something really neat about this particular species is that the larva will actually sow a small leaf nest, as you can see here on the right-hand side, and they live inside the leaf nest, and that aids in protecting them while they're in this kind of vulnerable caterpillar stage. And then they'll come out of the leaf nest to feed on the leaves and then go back and hide in the leaf nest. Usually that life stage is happening in and around late May and throughout the month of June. And then throughout most of its range, at that point when the larva is mature, around the end of June or early July, it will enter a period of diapause or inactivity where its metabolic rate slows down and it basically gets ready to hibernate already for the winter. When the leaf drops to the ground in the fall, the larva is still in that little leaf nest, and it won't do anything until the following spring when it pupates and then emerges as an adult butterfly really early in the spring. So there are records in the extreme southwestern Ontario, in and around St. Williams and Pinery, that indicate that there was actually 2 generations of the species over the summer. But in most of the locations that we know about right now in Ontario, there's only this 1 generation per year. So this is a distribution map of where the mottled duskywing currently and historically occurred. The yellow circles represent the extant locations that we know about. I've surveyed pretty far and wide. I'm pretty confident in the accuracy of this map. So you can see that most of the extant populations occur down in the Hamilton Oakville area. There's some small scattered populations. There's one population up in Simcoe County near Barrie. And then to the east there are several populations scattered throughout the Rice Lake Plains. But you can also see that all of the green and blue triangles, those represent historical populations. So locations where the mottled duskywing used to occur that it no longer does. And some of the more recent populations that have been lost include a few up near the Ottawa area. that were present until about 2007, and several down around the Hamilton, Burlington area, as well as down in Grand Bend. So as I noted, the recovery strategy for the mottled duskywing was completed in 2015. This is the document. You can access it online if you're interested in taking a look at it. So the recovery strategy essentially, it provides biological information on the species, but it also identifies the current threats to the species and what steps need to be taken in order to stop those threats and reverse the decline of the species. So why is the mottled duskywing a species at risk? Is usually an important question that needs to be understood when we talk about this species. So, I mean, like most species nowadays and biodiversity in general, wide-scale habitat loss was historically the main threat to this species. So clearing the land for agriculture and urban development resulted in a fragmented landscape in southern Ontario that left a lot of the habitats where the species occurred geographically isolated. And when you're a tiny little butterfly, you don't get around too easily across vast areas of unsuitable habitat. The other really important factor that I'll talk about today is the mismanagement of habitat. And what I mean by that is that these rare ecosystems known as oak savannas, where mottled duskywing is known to occur, they don't exist or they don't sustain themselves without some sort of disturbance regime. So historically, fire was a pretty common occurrence on the landscape in southern Ontario. Mostly this was initiated by First Nations people who use it as a way of managing the land. And so that type of management of the land resulted in good habitat for this species in that it promoted fire tolerant and species that regenerate easily and depend on fire for regeneration. It also helps keep all of the woody stuff out of the way that tend to fill in forests and result in a lot of canopy cover. And the species that mottled duskywing depend on, the New Jersey tea and the narrow-leaved New Jersey tea, they require some sort of disturbance. They don't do well in the shade. They like an open or semi-open canopy where the sunlight can reach them. And they also respond really well to fire disturbance. They come back really well the following year after a fire disturbance. So as Europeans settled the land and fire kind of disappeared from the landscape, a lot of our oak savannas also disappeared because there was no more management of those systems. Climate change is also a threat to the mottled duskywing, one that I'm sure is very important, but not one that we really fully understand yet. One of the main things that is concerning when it comes to butterflies in particular is that they have this really close association with their food plants as larvae. And so mottled duskywing is one of the most early emerging species that we have in Ontario. It usually is flying around by mid-May, so that's pretty early for a butterfly. And there's concern that if climate change changes the phenology of its host plant in a way that makes it unavailable to the butterflies when they hatch out in the spring, that could really mess up things for the butterfly. Pesticide use is also something that's very concerning when it comes to the loss, the historical and ongoing threats to this species, particularly the use of BTK to control gypsy moths. So as I'm sure you guys are aware, because we had a gypsy moth outbreak this year, that there was a lot of calls for municipalities and conservation authorities to spray these areas for gypsy moths. And the way they control gypsy moths is by doing these aerial spray programs of this insecticide that not only kills gypsy moth larvae, but will kill any butterfly or moth larva in that form at that time. So it's not necessarily harmful to adult butterflies or moths, but it has been shown to kill anything in caterpillar or larva form. So the timing of the application of gypsy moth spray is usually coincides with when you would expect to find larvae of mottled duskywing on plants. And anecdotally, the disappearance of mottled duskywing in several areas, including those areas in Ottawa, have coincided very closely with spraying for gypsy moths. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the term oak savanna that I just talked about, these are essentially communities with about 25 to 35% tree canopy closure. So for comparison, if you're thinking about the structure of a community, forest communities usually have over 60% tree canopy closure, right? They have thick canopy on the top. Woodlands usually have 35 to 60% tree canopy closure. Savannas have this more scattered tree system. And then once you get below that, you're looking more at like prairie or open meadow communities. In Southern Ontario, the trees that are associated with oak savanna are primarily black oak. And they usually have understory indicators that are consistent with what you would find in a tall grass prairie, such as big blue stem, wild bergamot, sunflowers, sky blue asters, smooth leaf asters, things like that, and wild lupin. As I noted, they're adapted to fire, which helps maintain this open or semi-open canopy. And because of this, fire suppression on the landscape is considered a really high threat to these communities. So this is visually what like an oak savanna system looks like. So you can see that it has this kind of scattered but really open canopy. This is a nice mature savanna, so it's got nice mature black oak trees and then this tall grass prairie in the understory. So in terms of oak savanna in Ontario, when we think about these types of communities, they used to be extremely widespread and abundant within North America. It's estimated that they covered more than 11 million hectares. In Ontario, we could have had up to about 2,000 kilometers squared of tall grass prairie and oak savanna before European settlement, based on the historical records. And as I noted, most of this land was converted to agriculture and housing developments. So I would say that at this point in time, we've lost more than 95% of our oak savannas in Southern Ontario. The largest remaining areas are in Pinery Provincial Park, Walpole Island, and down on the Ojibwe Prairie. So I just wanted to touch on a few other butterfly species because they're connected to the story that I'm telling tonight about the mottled duskywing, which you may have heard of before, one being the Carner blue, the other being the frosted elfin, and then the eastern Perseus duskywing. So these are three butterfly species that were all associated with oak savanna systems in Southern Ontario. All three of them used wild lupin as a host plant. And all three of them are now extirpated from Ontario and therefore Canada, because they only occurred in Ontario. So mottled duskywing is kind of one of four of these species that were specialists in these oak savanna systems, and three of them haven't been seen since the late 1980s, which is a sad story. If you look at a map of where these species occurred, the black triangles represent the Carner blue. So you can see that it was present at down near Long Point in the St. Williams area, over in Grand Bend, Sarnia, London, and in High Park in Toronto. The frosted elfin was only ever recorded at St. Williams Forestry Reserve, but I expect that it was probably much more widespread. It was just, we didn't know it was there until it was almost too late. And then the eastern Perseus duskywing was known from the Pinery and St. Williams area as well. And you can see, if you remember the map I showed you, the distribution of mottled duskywing, that a lot of these spots are the same locations where mottled duskywing also occurred. So mottled duskywing in some of these spots is the only specialist species that's still hanging on. So what is being done to protect and recover at mottled duskywing? Well, in 2017, I applied for funding from the Species at Risk Stewardship Program, which is a provincially funded program by the provincial government, to form a recovery team, essentially, and start really implementing some of the actions that had been identified in that recovery strategy. Up until that point, I had just kind of been doing piecemeal some of the tasks that I thought were needed to kind of lay the groundwork to do some meaningful recovery work. So this is a picture of the recovery team in 2019 at our meeting at the Toronto Zoo. It's a pleasure to be in this team with all of these amazing people. We represent a bunch of different groups, including not-for-profit such as Wildlife Preservation Canada and the Nature Conservancy. We also have several academic institutions that are partnered with us, the Cambridge Butterfly Conservatory, and everybody comes together with a different, everyone came together, I should say, with a different idea about what they wanted to achieve as part of this recovery team, but everyone works collaboratively together to achieve those goals. So until this point in 2017, when we formed the recovery team, all of these organizations or groups were doing something within their own organizations to help the mottled duskywing in some capacity, or help with restoring or preserving oak savanna habitat, but everyone was kind of working on their own. And so this recovery team and this initiative allowed everybody to come together to share information and to work together collaboratively towards a common goal. So at our first recovery team meeting, we decided we had to identify a mandate for our team. And we decided on a very simple mandate, just to promote the conservation recovery of Ontario's butterfly species at risk in their habitats. And we did this because although we had come together primarily focused on mottled duskywing, we wanted to have kind of a big picture in the background of the work that we were doing. Thinking about, if we were successful in recovering mottled duskywing, what did that mean for some of these other species at risk that have been extirpated? So we also identified some short-term goals, basically to support activities that protected extant populations of mottled duskywings, completed activities that resulted in the reestablishment of mottled duskywing at formerly occupied sites, supporting research, supporting creation and enhancement of oak savanna habitat, helping to support land managers who are out there trying to do something to protect and preserve these habitats, and of course to conduct public outreach and stewardship activities. So as part of this, one of the things, of course, we talked about was funding and how we would come up with the money to actually implement some of these bigger picture things, because it's not inexpensive. So up until this point, I had been applying kind of piecemeal every year, every 2 years for pieces of funding to kind of pick away at specific things that needed to be done here and there. But when it comes to like long-term recovery of a species, you kind of need to have a long-term plan. And then to implement a long-term plan, you need a bit of long-term funding. So we decided a subset of people on the recovery team to apply for a grant called the NSERC Alliance Grant. And this is a national research council grant that involves industrial and academic partnerships. So Dr. Ryan Norris at the University of Guelph, who is on our recovery team, he's a population biologist. He is the principal investigator of the grant. And then there are several main partners that I'll talk about. But as the main goal of the grant, we identified that we wanted to recover and maintain self-sustaining populations of mottled duskywing. And then of course, there were these 4 main pillars of that goal. One was reintroduction and augmentation. One was doing research to fill in critical knowledge gaps. One was public outreach and education. And then the last one was the development of a predictive population model and doing long-term monitoring. So the NSERC Alliance was considered an ideal grant for us to pursue because it was 5 years in duration. So it gave us like a more significant amount of time for a planning horizon. It also would guarantee us a 2-to-1 match. So for every dollar that we raised to put towards our grant, NSERC would give us $2 to match that. So in the end, we campaigned very hard and worked very hard, and Ryan and I were able to raise about $250,000 in cash matching contributions from various organizations. And so because of that, NSERC gave us another 500 and plus change. So we ended up with about $825,000 for our grant. So that meant we had 5 years and a serious chunk of change to actually do some stuff. So then we really got to work. So this is the main partners that are involved in the grant. You can see that Nature Conservancy and Norris Lab are the main 2 collaborators. And then there's several partners that all contribute significantly to this grant. So in terms of outcomes, the great thing about this, we have all these different things identified, but the biggest thing that costs money is and woman power. So with this grant, we were able to get a PhD student on board, up to 5 master's students. So we currently have 2 that are about to finish, and I'll talk about their project shortly, but we have funding for 3 more. And we also have funding for up to 12 summer students over the course of this grant. So that gave us all of the power we needed in terms of boots on the ground to actually do work, because it was becoming a little overwhelming for me to do a lot of this stuff all by myself. So this is the map I showed you earlier in the presentation of the distribution of the species. And you'll remember these yellow dots represent the extant populations. So the overall goal at the end of this Alliance grant is to, 1, have introduced a self-sustaining population of mottled duskywing to Pinery Provincial Park, to get the ball rolling on a 2nd population in Norfolk County. And then through this grant and the predictive population model, we also are thinking that we may be able to augment populations in the Rice Lake Plains and the Halton area that currently have a pretty low population size and may be below the minimum viable population size. So essentially filling in this map with more yellow circles. So I just wanted to talk to you about some of the current projects that we have going on right now. First and foremost, the Cambridge Butterfly Conservatory and their captive rearing program. So when it comes to recovery of a species, the implementation of a captive rearing, a successful captive rearing program is really where it all begins. And the Cambridge Butterfly Conservatory has spearheaded this for us with the mottled duskywing. We did start with trials of a closely related species called the wild indigo duskywing, which you may be familiar with. It's a pretty common and widespread duskywing species in Ontario. And we started playing around with that species in 2018. So they brought that species into recovery and used it essentially as a surrogate species to kind of hone in on what their rearing protocols were going to be in terms of temperature, light levels, enclosure types, all these kinds of things that you need to refine, but you don't necessarily want to do that at the expense of an endangered species. So in 2018, they did that. And then since 2019, annually, so this is our 3rd year in 2021, they've successfully brought female mottled duskywings into captivity and reared out many, many, many individuals. They've also been able to collect some amazing data on the natural history of this species that was just completely missing from our knowledge. Because it's like a very small cryptic species, especially when it's in its caterpillar form, we didn't know a lot of basic things, like how many eggs females are capable of laying, how long does it take to eggs to hatch, how many instars do the caterpillars have. These are things we just didn't know until we started rearing the species in captivity. Well, another one was, what does the chrysalis look like? I'd never seen a chrysalis before. I'd looked a lot, but digging through dead leaf nests at the bottom of the host plant, you can't find it. It's like impossible. So I was able to actually see a chrysalis for the first time at the conservatory, which was really exciting. Another project that we're working on is focused on the population size, demographics, and phenology of the species. And these are where Ryan Norris's master's student, Angela, and PhD student, Emily, come into the project. So we've been running a spatial Mercury sighting study with these students since 2019. So this involves marking butterflies strategically on their wings so we can identify individuals at 2 of the largest known populations in the Rice Lake Plains. So these populations are considered what we think are the strongholds on the largest populations. And so these 3 summers in a row, we've marked every individual throughout their entire flight period, and then implemented a mark recite daily program for the entire flight period. And so we've been able to collect really important data on how the butterflies move within their habitats, how many individuals there are in these populations, what the demographics are like when the females and males fly, and is that different? How do the populations of those 2 different sexes differ? So really valuable information that we had no idea about previously. So just to show you a little bit about how we mark them, we actually use quick dry Sally Hansen nail polish. And we mark their wings. We chill them in a cooler first so they become inactive, and then we put the colored markings on their wings, and then we release them. So you can see we have this numbering system. So between the numbers and the colors, we can individually identify each butterfly. And the nail polish stands out pretty well. So once they're released, you can just resight them with binoculars. So another really important project to this recovery program is one focused on genetics. And this study has been led by Dr. Nusha Kegobadi at the University of Western Ontario and her master's student, Shayla. So when you talk about captive rearing and reintroduction, knowing what the genetics of our existing stock populations in Ontario is a really important question. So we set out to identify, one, how genetically similar the extant populations are. Shayla has also been developing the genetic markers for this species, which don't currently exist at all. And then she's also looking at something called Wolbachia strains, which is a bacterium that naturally occurs in all or most Lepidoptera populations, and usually is not harmful in any way. However, if you mix strains of this bacterium, it can cause issues with reproduction. So it comes into play when we talk about bringing things into captivity or releasing butterflies to certain areas and mixing those populations. So this research really informed our source population selection, so where we chose to take individuals from in order to rear them and release them somewhere else. And it also has told us some really important information, like the extant populations within the Rice Lake area, Halton Burlington area are genetically dissimilar enough that you can tell that they've been separated for some significant amount of time. So this is Shayla in the field. So essentially all she does is when the butterflies cooled and we're getting ready to mark them, she takes a tiny little piece of the back of their wing, which doesn't impact their flight at all. If you've ever seen a butterfly that's lived for a few days, you've probably noticed that their wings can get quite beaten up. So she takes this tiny little sample and preserves it in ethanol, and that's enough for her to extract the DNA from. So over the course of the last 2 years, Shayla was able to get 300 samples from 12 sites, which is essentially almost every extant subpopulation we know about in Ontario. She also got 12 whole butterflies that expired in captivity from the captive rearing program. And then she's also got 26 museum samples, including samples from populations that no longer are extant in Ontario. And we're hoping that she'll be able to extract DNA from them as well. So this all kind of led to this accumulation of what we were working towards, which was to take mottled duskywing and start reintroducing it to formerly occupied locations or new locations with suitable habitat. So the first location that was chose was Pinery Provincial Park. And this was essentially my first choice for a reintroduction location. One, because it occurred at Pinery up until the early 1990s. I was fairly confident in why it disappeared from the park, which was, one, for a long time, the park was managed in a way that wasn't conducive to preserving oak savanna habitat. There wasn't fire or active tree thinning in the park, so the canopy kind of closed in, and there was no longer that savanna characteristic to the park anymore. Secondly, the deer population in the 80s was out of control, and deer love New Jersey tea. So they just would browse it like to the ground, totally eradicated the plant. And so when the current management came into the park, which is about 20 years ago, Alistair McKenzie, he really understood the value of oak savanna habitat and protecting and preserving that. And so from that time on, they started instituting regular prescribed burning within the park, thinning pines that had been planted, controlling the deer population. They have an agreement with the local First Nations. to harvest from the park, which has controlled the deer population. And once they started putting in all these checks and balances, the New Jersey tea and the habitat for mottled duskywing completely rebounded. So it went from being a plant that was almost extirpated from the park, but the seed bank was still there, to being probably one of the most abundant understory shrubs in the park. It's also a protected area, and the park was very supportive of our desire to reintroduce the species. So all of these things combined made for a good recipe for our first reintroduction location. So this is an example of what the oak savanna looks like at Pinery. For those of you who have never been to Pinery, I would recommend going. It's one of the most beautiful provincial parks, I think. I have a fondness for it for sure. As I noted, they conduct regular prescribed burning there every year, or at least every year that they get conditions suitable to conduct prescribed burning. And so this has really resulted in a lot of New Jersey tea. This is an example of one of the sites that we're targeting reintroduction. The green blobs are huge patches of the host plant, and the little green dots are individual plants or patches less than 1 meter. So this kind of just gives you an idea of the extent of how abundant the plant is in these areas. We basically had divided our reintroduction areas up into 50 by 50 meter grids, which is what you see here, as a way of collecting data on the project, which I'll talk about a bit more. So in 2021, all of the work that the recovery team had been doing basically led up to this moment in 2021, when we were actually ready to take captively reared mottled duskywing from the Butterfly Conservatory and release it at Pinery Provincial Park. Up until this point, all of the butterflies that we reared at the conservatory, we released back to the natal site where we took them from in the Rice Lake Plains. But this time we actually took a portion of them and took them to Pinery. I should mention that for every butterfly that we do take out of the wild at their natal location, we put 20 back. So we have instituted a program so that we're not depleting the population that we're taking from, but we're also creating more in a captive situation than would naturally occur in the wild, because we've taken predation and all these other threats out of the equation. And so we have enough overstock to release them somewhere else. So in 2021, we decided to approach this project using 3 different release treatments. And so basically we had 3 different geographically spread out areas in the park. They were all more than 1 kilometer apart. And we introduced at one site late instar larvae, so mature caterpillars. At one site, we reintroduced pupa or chrysalis. And at one site, we actually reintroduced 2nd generation adults. And the reason we took 3 different approaches is because we weren't sure what was going to work the best. This is the first reintroduction program for a butterfly in Ontario, but there have been many other butterfly reintroductions in the United States and in other provinces and further west of Ontario and Canada. And every species seems to want to do something different. So some programs have been successful releasing caterpillars, some have been more successful releasing butterflies, and some have been more successful releasing pupa. And we didn't know which one was going to work for mottled duskywing. And because of the great work the conservatory was doing, we had a lot of individuals to work with. And we knew that they weren't at Pinery currently. So we had this opportunity to kind of study how things reacted. And the reason, of course, we want to know what works best is because it will be much more efficient moving forward in terms of captive rearing if we have a goal in mind. If we know we don't have to rear them all the way out to adult butterfly and we can just release caterpillars, it's a lot easier to do that. It saves us time, it saves us money. So that was like one of the main goals this year. So after we did the releases, we had a crew of 4 people there every day doing monitoring 7 days a week at these release sites. So in terms of our post-introduction monitoring protocol, we had some main goals that we identified in year 1. One was to determine the survival success of the different life stages. So as things were released, how well did they survive over this first year? We also have a goal of estimating population size, but that won't really come into play until a subsequent year because we knew exactly how many we released this year. We want to also track unassisted dispersal within the park. So once these individuals are released at a particular location, how do they naturally move in their habitat? We also have instituted protocols to monitor changes in the habitat structure, and of course, ongoing documentation of and mitigation of threats to the species. So in total, this year, we released 382 larvae. Interestingly, Pinery is one of the locations that the historical records suggest that they had 2 generations. So they would have had an adult flight period from late May until the end of June. The caterpillars would have pupated and emerged as a 2nd generation of adults that flew in August. And then those individuals would have laid eggs and had their larvae over winter. The population that we take from as our captive rearing source is a population that's in the Rice Lake Plains further east, and they only have 1 generation a year. But interestingly, when we reverted them back to this exposure of temperature and light levels at the Pinery, they reverted back to some of them to 2 generations. So the ones that were released early enough in the season actually pupated and had a 2nd generation of butterflies, and ones that we released later on in the season, they actually diapaused. So we released them essentially in their little leaf nest, and we flagged it and tried to track what happened with them. And so we did collect some really interesting data, and of course we're interested to see how many of them make it over the winter. For the pupa, or the chrysalis, each one of them was glued to a tiny little stick. You can see there on the left-hand side. We released 138 of them, and we released them in these tiny enclosures you can see on the right, which is essentially just a piece of cut off PCV pipe with a really fine screen mesh on the bottom, so it could drain, but things couldn't crawl up through the ground. And then had a wider mesh on the top so that the butterfly could get out once it hatched, but birds and larger predators would have a harder time getting in to get the pupa. This was an approach that was suggested to me by Jarrett Daniels, a researcher at the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera in Florida, who's done many different releases, and they use this for the Miami blue butterfly, which is a species they're working on recovering. So overall, we had an 82% rate of eclosure, meaning 82% of the pupa that we released hatched. The other ones that didn't hatch were either predated, mostly by ants, or didn't develop properly for whatever reason. But 82% was a very high rate that we were really happy with. And then for the adult butterflies, we released a total of 172. We marked them before we released them. And so all we had to do was go around and recite them to understand where they went and what they were doing. And out of all those butterflies that we released, we only had a 4% mortality rate, which is mainly that they didn't come out of their chrysalis properly. So we were really happy with that as well. So overall, at Pinery in 2021, we released 692 mottled duskywing, which is considered pretty exceptional. I've been talking with other recovery groups across Canada and the United States in preparation for this, and some recovery teams were happy that they had like 10 butterflies in a season to release, because they're dealing with species that are really rare and really difficult to rear in captivity. So we consider ourselves very lucky that the Cambridge Butterfly Conservatory has been so successful, and we're able to start with like such a good number on our first year. We had a full-time crew, as I mentioned, monitoring the population every single day, 7 days a week for 6 weeks at Pinery. Probably the single most exciting thing that happened within a few days of our adult releases is that we confirmed that females were laying eggs on New Jersey tea in the wild at Pinery, which was super exciting. And most of our preliminary observations this year indicate that the butterflies tended to stay in the areas where we released them. So we didn't see any dispersal this year, which indicates to me that they were pretty happy with their chosen home for them. I know in the States, I talked with one person at NCC property where they had done a Karner Blue reintroduction project, and they had a really high mortality rate their first year. And interestingly, most of the butterflies that they did recite were in an area where they didn't release them, meaning that the butterflies moved there on their own for some reason, and weren't successful in the area they were released. So I was really happy to see that these butterflies were staying where we released them. They were laying eggs and seemed to be happy. So in terms of next steps, of course, in 2022, we'll have our monitoring program again, which will start in early spring when the first generation will be expecting to hatch, so probably around mid-May. And it will go all the way until September. We'll also be releasing additional butterflies, larvae, and pupa. So we plan to do the same treatment for a second year. Most butterfly reintroduction programs require 3 to 4 years of releases before you get a self-sustaining population. So we'll see how we do, but we've kind of planned at this point that we'll be doing multiple years of reintroductions. Another really exciting thing we have going on is this whole process for the last 2 years anyway has been documented by Pine Grove Productions, who are going to be filming and creating a full-length documentary about this process that we've gone through with all the different team members. They've been at all the major milestones throughout what we've been doing, and they'll be there next year while we're waiting, holding our breath to see if any mottled duskywing emerge next year. And then we're also going to be start looking at, as we understand how the program is working at Pinery, we'll start looking at additional locations and augmentations for other populations in Ontario. So I'd just like to say something about the Butterfly Species at Risk team and acknowledge all of their hard work and how amazing everyone has been at making this work happen. We actually have a website now, which is on butterflysar.com. So if you're interested in learning more about the people on the recovery team or the projects, I also try to regularly update the news and events page. So I put media posts there. There's a really great video that one of our PhD student made on the mottled duskywing. So I encourage you to visit the website for more information. I'd also really like to acknowledge our Pinery crew. We had 4 amazing summer students at Pinery this year that were so enthusiastic and so dedicated to this project, which, you know, as someone who has kind of tended to it as my baby for the last 10 years, you know, I'm putting the daily monitoring in the hands of someone else. It was such a relief to see how excited and dedicated these students were to this project. So I'd just like to acknowledge them. And as well as our funding sources for this project. So that's my email there and my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out and ask questions, but I'd be happy to take questions now as well.
Oh, thank you. That's great. Thank you very much, Jessica. Think you can hear me now, can you?
Yep.
What? Yeah, you stopped sharing your screen. That's good. And I think, you know, we can open the floor to questions, and you can either put your question in the chat, or you can unmute and ask your question in person. But I just want to thank Jessica not only for her presentation tonight, but for all the work she's been doing on this project. And the club has made a donation to the project through the Toronto Entomologists Association as a thank you for Jessica's presentation tonight.
Thank you.
So I might just ask a couple of the first questions. Curious about the population in Barrie. Was that in the, where was there oak savanna down in that area? Was there in the Minising area or?
So most of the habitats for mottled duskywing are in oak savanna, but they also occur in alvar habitats as well. And I can't disclose specific locations because it's considered a data sensitive species. But it's in an area that is subject to a high level of disturbance, if that gives any hints away.
Okay. And you mentioned a little bit about BTK spraying. This is, of course, you may get some questions about that because this is quite an issue in our area. We have on the western beaches of Tiny, the shoreline associations are really pushing the Tiny Township to institute BTK spraying next year, even though probably the gypsy moth will be on kind of the downslide next year. I imagine if they found any mottled duskywings there, that would prevent any spraying, but that's not going to happen, right? Are there any other endangered species in the Tiny area that might be useful in stopping that type of program?
Well, that I don't know about, but I do know. So I was working, I wrote a letter of support and I was working towards, so in the United States, they use an alternative product to BTK called Gyp Check. And it's essentially I'm trying to think of the right word, an artificial version of the, or a composed version of the virus that naturally occurs in gypsy moth populations. So the way gypsy moth populations work is they're cyclical, and as they build their populations up to large numbers, this virus that naturally occurs in populations builds up as well, and it's spread through their frass or their poop. So when the population gets really dense and there's a lot of poop, then they spread the virus to each other and they kill each other off, and that's what knocks the population back. And I did see evidence of the virus taking hold this year. You can tell because they'll hang and kind of droopy in the shape of a V on the trees. And that's an indication that the virus is taking hold. But people in the States actually use this virus to control the population as well, particularly in places where they have sensitive butterfly or moth species at risk, including the Carnar blue. And essentially it just speeds up the process of the virus. And so until this year, the virus is not available in Canada, but there was a company that was working on trying to make it commercially available, and they didn't get their registration done in time in order to make it available, but it looks like they will have it in place for next year. So I am encouraging people, like, I honestly think the first and foremost, that spraying doesn't need to happen. I don't think it's necessary. I think that gypsy moths are an inconvenient pest and they're gross. Nobody likes them, like they're pretty gross. But in general, a healthy system, a healthy tree will rebound from a gypsy moth infestation, and that it's just kind of an inconvenience. It's not something that needs to happen. So first I would say we don't need to spray, but for the municipalities and the people who really feel like something needs to be done, I would say that secondly, they should consider this virus spray as an alternative to the BTK.
Could you spell that product name? Because I think that would be a good suggestion for our politicians who just feel compelled to do something.
Yes. It's going to be marketed under the name Bover here in Ontario or in Canada. And I can certainly, I don't see I was just looking because I just got another email. They're looking for another letter of support. But it's an MPV product, which is, NPV is the name of the virus, which
Right.
I'm not going to spell for you because it's a really long name. I don't know how to spell.
Ken, we had one other question I see in the chat on that. Somebody's asking whether that virus would have any effect on other insects besides the gypsy moth, and I assume it's specific to the gypsy moth.
That's correct. Yeah, it's a species. So whereas the BTK is like it is specific to Lepidopteran larvae, the virus is only specific to gypsy moth. It doesn't infect other species.
Okay, I'm going to read a couple other questions from the chat here.
Sure.
Susan McMillan asks, will more people having New Jersey tea in their yards help even though they are not in savanna habitat?
Yeah, good question. So planting New Jersey tea in your backyard probably won't benefit the mottled duskywing, but New Jersey tea is an amazing plant for pollinators. So whenever I visit flowering New Jersey tea, I see an incredible diversity of flies and moths and Hymenoptera. So in general, I think it's just a beneficial plant to plant in your garden if you're looking at increasing biodiversity of insects.
And Kate Harries, who's our native plant expert, has just suggested that if anyone does plant New Jersey tea, be sure to protect it from rabbits. How would they do that, Kate? How do you protect things from a rabbit? I'd like to know that. How do you protect it from chipmunks?
Well, I wrap anything I want to protect from rabbits with a circle of chicken wire, and that works. That'll do it.
Chicken wire. And Andy, what about chipmunks?
I'm not sure about chipmunks. What are the chipmunks doing to you, Ken?
Oh, they eat everything. And I tried, I have to confess, it's a terrible thing for a naturalist to confess. But a few years ago, I tried a chipmunk relocation program. I got a live trap. And I gave up after I took 50 chipmunks in succession up to the golf course. And I think, basically that type of thing, like any removing the pest from the landscape doesn't work because another pest just moves in.
A
Right?
dog helps.
A dog helps. Okay. I used to have a dog. Okay. And Susan also wanted to know, back to Jessica, how much do the instars eat?
That's a good question. I bet you the butterfly conservatory could tell you leaf for leaf. Overall, like last year we raised, I think, 1,800 larvae. They eat a lot collectively. An individual caterpillar, isn't eating a ton of leaves. We sustain them on a small plant.
And just reading the comments, Adrian Perry says, amazing work and great presentation. Thank you. And from Annie G here. I'm a member of Lambton Wildlife Incorporated in Lambton County. Our nature group was happy to donate to Jessica's project. So glad to hear how well the program is going down the road from us at the Pinery. Congrats on the first year.
Well, thank you. And thank you. Lambton Wildlife Inc. donated a generous contribution to that NSERC Alliance grant. So I would like to acknowledge them again for doing that. And I'm hoping that I'll get back soon to that group to give another presentation soon.
Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
I grew up in Sarnia, so I've been to the Pinery many times, and we took my nieces and nephews when they were young kids too. So I know that area very well. And Jessica, I wondered, knowing how many campsites, group campsites, trails there are, without, I guess, detailing exactly where you released the moss, I wondered how you released them and kept them away from the many people that are there.
Yeah, so there are areas of the park that are heavily used by people, but there are, the park is huge, and there are huge areas too that aren't really visited by park goers, and that's quite intentional, I think, too. So they're in areas where there are no active recreational, authorized trails. And in areas where there are higher proportions of, protected species. So the park actively tries to keep people out of those areas. So we didn't have any issues with people wandering onto our sites or anything like that.
How far away were they from the trails?
Well, one of them had a trail right kind of on the edge, but in general, I think people the Pinery has done a very good job of providing a really nice trail network. So I think generally, because the park is covered in poison ivy and people are scared of ticks, that they stay out of the areas where they're not supposed to go. So, and I got lots of ticks and lots of poison ivy to prove it.
That was Dorothy McEwen asking the question. I think she's watching with Claire. Annie G came up with a suggestion for my chipmunks. She puts rocks around the base of the plant. It stops them from digging the plant. And we've still got the floor. Anybody else have any questions? I was wondering that this documentary sounds exciting. Now, usually if a documentary is really good, though, eventually Hollywood wants to make kind of a dramatized version of it. So who do you want to play you in the dramatized version of it, Jessica?
Oh, that's hilarious.
We can take suggestions from the floor on that. I think Renee Zellweger would be good.
Oh my God, that's so funny. My partner says that too, that I look like Renee Zellweger. I guess that's not a bad thing.
No, that's a good thing. Any other questions? Maybe we can talk a little bit. just because you gave us a great idea of what you're doing for the mottled Duskywing, but maybe just because I'm sure some people are thinking, well, why all this effort for a little brown butterfly? Maybe we can just backtrack to the whole philosophy of why we need to preserve even a tiny little species like this.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and of course, like I could talk all night about some of these things, so I have to try and scope my presentation in a given evening. But I did my master's work on using butterflies as biological indicators of how healthy ecosystems are. So it's kind of something that's interested me for a really long time. And I am very well aware that oak savanna habitat and tallgrass prairie habitat in Ontario and throughout North America is extremely rare now. And there's a really high percentage of species associated with those habitats. And the majority of them that are specialized in those habitats are species at risk. So that includes birds, plants, snakes, a wide variety of wildlife. So butterflies are something that are a good indicator because they are tangible to people. They're something that people can see. People can't see often cryptic snakes, nor do they want to. They're kind of a sexy thing for conservation. People like butterflies. They make really good educational tools. And there's something that I'm passionate about. So I feel strongly that this species, although the focus of our work is on this species, it contributes in a really meaningful way to the overall recovery of the habitat. And really at the end of the day, I think we should be taking a habitat recovery approach to things. But currently the way things are structured with our funding and the way that the government approaches things, it's not that way. It's species specific. So we kind of have to use species as a tool in order to initiate change and build these habitats. So I'm hoping that the recovery of this species has what we call a conservation ripple effect, and that it will benefit many other species, even if kind of the poster species we're using for that recovery is the mottled Duskywing.
Okay, we got a question here from Judy Hardy. You mentioned that albars are habitats for them, so are there none in the Carden albar? As a naturalist group here in Midland, a lot of our members are very familiar and spend a lot of time over in Carden.
Yeah, and people have looked for mottled Duskywing there many times. People I know that are familiar with mottled Duskywing, and it hasn't been found. And I don't know why that is. I've only been to Carden albar twice, and it was to survey lady beetles, but I don't recall there being a very large population of the host plant there. But it is possible that it did once occur there. I don't know. But there never has been any records for that area.
No historical records, so it wouldn't be targeted for reintroduction at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, if the habitat was suitable, it certainly would be a location I would look at. But from what I recall, that area too, it has a long history of agricultural influences as well. So that could have had, an impact on what was natively there.
Okay, and I just maybe as we wrap things up, type more questions in or unmute yourself if you have any more questions. But I wouldn't mind, why don't we just give a bit more a plug to the Cambridge Butterfly Conservancy? Because when you say that and with your work, people might think, well, this is some sort of laboratory that with all the, but it's a tourist attraction, right? And
That's
it's a
true,
great place.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you haven't been there, I would recommend going, especially in the winter. It's really nice. It's like a little tropical reprieve. And of course, I worked there when I was 19 years old. It was my first real job related to biology in any way. And I would say that it definitely kickstarted my real career path in terms of pursuing things with butterflies. So it's an amazing place. It has a beautiful tropical garden and tropical butterflies, but they are very interested and focused as well on insect and butterfly education and outreach as well.
And I just like to say the Cambridge Butterfly Conservancy was actually started by an old childhood friend of mine, a fellow by the name of John Powers. Now, some of you may have seen John Powers when he came through. He used to come through with his bug show to the Mountain View Mall and other places. But Unfortunately, John passed away a little while ago, and but I'm sure he'd be pleased that I don't know what's happened to my camera. Anyways,
Well, he taught me a lot about butterflies, that's for sure, when I was just getting started, and I just soaked it all up.
Heather, did you have a question? Nope. Somehow you popped up on the screen here. My camera's going wild. But anyways, I think, Susan, did you have anything else to say, or before we wrap up?
Just a big thank you again to Jessica for the work that you're doing and for a really good presentation. And yeah, good luck going forward with it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everybody.
And somebody's asking, John, the man who traveled to malls with so many specimens. Yeah, that was John Powers. And I think John was probably the first naturalist that I ever knew, because when we were like young teenagers, when all the other kids were up playing road hockey, John was running through the fields with a butterfly net. And he used to do nature displays in the town parks there in Preston, and he was quite an individual. But anyways, as you know, I usually like to wrap these things up with something a little on the lighter side. Hope you know that doesn't bother anybody. So I'm going to try to share my screen and share something here. This is a performance back in the 60s by Lucille Ball, believe it or not. Apparently there's a movie coming out where about Lucille Ball. But this is Lucille Ball doing the butterfly ballet. So I'll run this, and then you're welcome to leave right now or leave at the end of it and just filter away. And thanks everybody for coming. Oops.
Now that's something you don't see every day. Okay, well. Can any information on next month? I think you're muted.
Are there going to be sightings too?
You're muted, Ken.
Yeah, I should have mentioned in the meeting, because most people have left now, but next month, our presenter will be Nick Ailes. And Nick Ailes is a geologist, so he'll be talking about the geology of our area. He's written a lot of books, very popular books about rocks in Ontario. But he's also kind of involved in this project you may have read about in the paper to make our area a UN geopark or something like that. But yeah, he's got a presentation about the geology of the area, but he might talk a little bit about that project as well. So it should be good.
Sounds good.
Although he's asked to do it a little differently, so he wants to send us his presentation. He'll be present on the meeting, but he's going to send us his presentation, and I'll kind of play it from my system, and then he'll take questions, type of thing.
Sure, whatever works for him, right?
Aren't you doing sightings, Ken?
What's that?
Sightings? Bird sightings? Butterfly sightings?
Not quite. Is that Dorothy?
Dorothy, yeah. Don't
I'm not
you
quite
do
hearing your
sightings
question,
still?
Dorothy.
Sorry. Don't you do sightings still? What people have seen?
We haven't been on these things. We could maybe start doing that. We sort of, most of the things we've had the presentation, we haven't done much of a business meeting. That's a good idea. I know Barry does that. Well, got some sightings you want to tell us about?
Nothing different from last week.
Well, you gave them at Nature Berry, not here. Give them to these guys.
I can't remember now. Well, I guess we've had like over 1,000 loons in Keppenfelt Bay, but then when Phyllis and I went, they were way in the middle. We couldn't really see.
Yeah, lots of loons on Keppenfelt Bay. I haven't got down there.
Hopefully live ones too, yeah. I wanted to ask the ones that been seen in Tiny, is it, was it loons or cormorants or?
I haven't really heard. I think it was a lot of grebes, really, but maybe some
yeah.
loons as well. But I think it's mostly grebes that are turning up. And, sometimes somebody finds they don't really identify the bird. There could be a western grebe. That'd be exciting, but it looked like a lot. The pictures in the paper were mostly redneck grebes, I think.
And an American coot in the near the marina downtown. I know, Phyllis, do you have anything?
Phyllis is still muted.
I'm mute. No, actually, I was in Penetanguishene today and I saw a bald eagle down at the dock lunch. Mature bald eagle.
Nice.
The nice thing up here in the last couple of days, I've been out with Bob and we've been seeing a lot of migrating flocks of bluebirds, which are nice to see this time of year. I had a flock of about 10 of them yesterday down at the down near Vasey, and we had some over at the Martins Valley Tract, and we also had there's fox sparrows coming through right now. We had a kind of a small flock of fox sparrows as well, which are a beautiful bird.
Don't forget those incredible phallic-looking mushrooms that we saw.
Yeah, we had some very rude-looking mushrooms that if you go to the club Facebook page, they're on there. Phallus this and phallus that, they call
You can't make this stuff up.
it. Well, I think that's about it. Usually a lot of people have filtered away. I'm not sure, maybe Lucy turned them off. I don't know.
Just one last question for you guys. Any walks coming up, or is it still to be to be
Still to be
announced.
determined. I usually look ahead to what the weather's doing, and it might be nice to get
Changing
one.
every day.
It might be nice to get one in next weekend, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend. We'll talk to Bob and Heather about it. And I was telling before you joined, Bob, that I went yesterday down to the Ganaraska Trail, starting just above Vasey Road, and it was quite nice. It had some interesting things, and I didn't go very far. But the downside was there's a sign right at the beginning of the trail that the private property owner has requested no dogs.
Interesting.
And then there's another sign that says keep your dog on a leash. So, but I'm thinking maybe we can find another entry point where there isn't a sign, because I'm out walking on the trail there, and a couple of ladies come by on their horses with two big dogs, and there was
And
a
the
lot
dogs
more.
weren't on leashes.
Dogs weren't on leashes, and there was I would think horse poop is even harder to clean up than dog poop, really, but.
Isn't there an entrance to the trail there off of Hog Valley Road, I think?
Yeah, probably. Like it goes right up to to where we walk, to that trail where we walk at with the colored water lilies.
It's interesting that you found bluebirds there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of tree sparrows and kinglets, and but there were some butterflies in the field. I actually had that monarch butterfly I saw yesterday there, which
Oh,
seems
really?
kind of late
That's
for a
very
monarch. Looks like a freshly hatched monarch as well. Oh, you forgot to tell me to stop recording.
Stop recording, Ken.
You never asked her to do that.
Where's that button?
Delete all those comments or get people's permission.
There we go.